My name is Linda. I'm 63 years old, and I live alone in a cedarwood cabin just outside Bozeman, Montana. It's quiet out here, the kind of quiet most people aren't used to anymore. But I've always liked the sound of wind through pine trees more than traffic or small talk. My husband Daniel built this cabin with his own hands long before cancer took him. It became our escape, then my refuge, and in time, it became home. My son Brian used to love it here. When he was little, he'd spend hours chasing frogs down by the creek or helping Daniel chop kindling, even though the logs were too heavy for him. After Daniel passed, it was just the two of us. We were close in a way I thought would last forever. He called me every other day through college. We'd talk about everything from his classes to what he was cooking for dinner. When he got his first job in Denver, I sent him care packages, cookies, notes, little reminders that he wasn't alone out there. Then he met Chloe. At first, I was happy for him. Brian was always the kind who loved deeply, sometimes too fast. He said she was different, grounded, smart. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But over time, the calls came less often. Holidays became, maybe this year we'll stay here instead. The texts turned into one-word answers. Then silence. I still remember the exact moment it all changed. I was on the porch trimming the flower boxes when the phone rang. It was Brian. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered with a smile already forming on my face. He didn't waste time. Just said they had gotten married that morning. A quick civil ceremony. Just the two of them and a couple of friends. No family. No celebration. I said nothing for a long moment. I don't know if it was shock or sadness or both sitting on my chest like a stone. And then, as if that news wasn't enough, he asked me to send over the keys to the cabin. They wanted to use it for their honeymoon. Just for a week or so. Some peace and quiet in the woods. No questions, no explanations. Just the keys. I said sure. I told him I'd send them. I hung up, walked back into the house, and sat down on the old bench Daniel built me. For a long while, I didn't move. I just stared out at the trees, swaying in the wind, like nothing had happened. But something had. Something cracked deep inside me that afternoon. It wasn't just about being excluded from the wedding. It wasn't even about the cabin. It was the realization that the boy I raised, the man I believed I knew, had been slipping away for longer than I wanted to admit. And I let it happen. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a pen in my hand. If they wanted a honeymoon in the cabin, they'd get one. But they'd also get a gift. Something a little more lasting than a card or a casserole. Something wrapped not in ribbon, but in truth. I've always believed that love means telling someone what they need to hear, even when it's hard. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is show someone exactly what they've chosen to ignore. Brian and Chloe wanted solitude. They had no idea just how much it would reveal. Brian brought her up one weekend in early spring, the kind of afternoon when the snow's almost gone but the air still bites. I had made pot roast, the kind he used to ask for on birthdays. Chloe walked in carrying a bottle of wine and a smile that never quite touched her eyes. She was pretty in that polished magazine cover way. Hair too perfect, voice just soft enough. Her compliments so smooth they almost felt rehearsed. She told me I had a beautiful home, that my roast smelled like something from a French bistro, and that Brian had told her I was the strongest woman he knew. It should have felt flattering, but instead I felt like I was being interviewed for a position I didn't know I'd applied for. She asked questions too, the kind that slipped into the conversation like butter. How long had I lived here? Was this place always so peaceful? Had I ever thought about selling? I gave polite answers, kept my voice steady, but a small knot was already forming in my stomach. Then, she brought up the cabin. Not casually, not the way people do when they're just curious. She wanted to know how far it was from here, what the winters were like, and whether there were any neighbors nearby. She said it sounded dreamy, like something out of a romance novel, and joked about how she wouldn't mind honeymooning somewhere like that. Brian laughed and squeezed her hand. I smiled, but something inside me didn't. There was nothing outright wrong about her. She was sweet, attentive, the kind of woman most mothers would be thrilled to see on their son's arm. But everything about her felt just a little too smooth, like a story someone tells when they've practiced the lines. Maybe I was being unfair. Maybe I just missed the days when Brian used to call every night and tell me about the dumb things that made him laugh. After they left, I stood at the sink rinsing plates, while the silence settled back in around the house. I told myself not to read too much into it. People change. Brian was growing up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Chloe hadn't come here just to meet me. She came to measure something. Maybe the view, maybe the square footage, or maybe how easy it'd be to move out of the way. After that visit, things started to shift in small ways at first. The phone calls came less often. At first, I blamed his work schedule. Then maybe the excitement of a new relationship. But the excuses kept stacking up, and the silence between us grew heavier. When we did talk, Chloe's name came up more and more. Not just in passing, but woven into every decision. She thought he should focus more on building their future. She suggested he spend less time traveling to Montana. She didn't like how often he relied on me for advice. The tone of his voice had changed, too. Softer around her, distant around me. I told myself this was what growing up looked like. Children pull away, they make new circles, new priorities. But this didn't feel like natural space. It felt constructed, like someone was gently rearranging the pieces of his life, and I no longer fit into the picture. I found out about their engagement on social media. A photo of them at a vineyard. Chloe's hand front and center. A diamond, the size of a marble catching the light. The caption read, "He asked." I said yes. Dozens of comments poured in from friends and coworkers, all gushing about how perfect they looked. Not one mention of family. Certainly not me. I stared at that post for a long time. My coffee going cold on the table. I didn't cry. I just sat there, wondering when exactly I'd become someone it was okay to leave out. When I finally called, Brian picked up, cheerful and apologetic in the same breath. He said it happened fast, that they got caught up in the moment, that Chloe's parents were already planning a celebration. Something intimate, just a few people, nothing big. I asked when the party was. He hesitated. Then he told me they'd decided to keep it small, just Chloe's side for now, because her family had their own traditions and wanted things a certain way. I said I understood, though I didn't. I said I was happy for them, though I wasn't sure that was true anymore. That night, I sat alone on the porch, wrapped in Daniel's old sweater, listening to the woods around me. And for the first time in years, I felt like an outsider in my own story, like someone had rewritten the script and handed me a smaller part. The moment Brian asked for the cabin keys, something clicked. Not anger, not yet, but a tightening in my chest that told me this wasn't just about a honeymoon. It felt strategic, calculated. Chloe had always shown too much interest in that cabin, and now it wasn't just theoretical. She wanted in. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting the past few months replay in my mind like a movie I hadn't realized I was starring in. Every skipped call, every vague excuse, every carefully worded update about their relationship. It wasn't distance. It was removal. And I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was orchestrating it behind the scenes. The next morning, I dug out an old address book from the kitchen drawer, flipped through until I found a name I hadn't called in years. Debbie Carlson. A friend of Brian's from college. Debbie had always been sharp, the kind of girl who remembered birthdays and spotted lies before they fully formed. I called her under the pretense of catching up. Within 10 minutes, we were talking about Chloe. She hesitated at first. Then she asked if I knew that Chloe used to go by another name, Claire Benson. The hair on my arm stood up. Debbie said they'd met briefly at a mutual friend's party years ago, and back then, Chloe was dating someone named Gavin Brooks. Apparently, Gavin had a reputation. Smooth talker, lots of money. But no one ever saw him work. Rumor was, he targeted women from wealthy families, swept them off their feet, and drained their bank accounts. I thanked Debbie and hung up, trying to ignore the pounding in my ears. I spent the rest of that afternoon searching every corner of the internet. Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and even the less obvious places. I found an old wedding registry under the name Claire Benson. No wedding date listed. Just a few items marked purchased. One of the buyers had the last name Brooks. It wasn't enough to confront Brian. Not yet. But I needed more. Real answers, real facts. I called a private investigator the next day, a woman named Meredith who specialized in background checks and digital forensics. I told her I needed to know everything about Chloe, where she came from, who she really was, and what she wanted. While Meredith worked, I waited. Each day, I walked through the cabin, running my fingers across the old pine railings, remembering Daniel's laugh, echoing through the halls. I wasn't just fighting to protect a house. I was fighting to protect the last piece of my family that hadn't been rewritten. 3 days later, Meredith called. Her voice was calm, but tight. Chloe, she said, had changed names twice. Her financial records were spotty. She had a long-term connection to Gavin Brooks, and Gavin had been investigated twice for financial fraud, both times involving wealthy women whose families owned property. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. And my son was next. There's a photo of Daniel above the fireplace. He's wearing that ridiculous fishing hat I always tried to throw out, grinning like a fool with a trout in each hand. That was the summer he finally finished building the deck out back. He didn't believe in shortcuts. Every nail, every beam in this cabin, he measured twice and cut once. Daniel poured himself into this place. It was more than a project. It was his way of giving us roots. He built the kitchen counters lower so I could knead dough without straining my back. He carved our initials into a beam above the bedroom door, so even in sleep, we'd remember we were part of something. After he died, the cabin became my anchor. It was where I grieved, where I healed, and where I learned how to be alone, without being lonely. Brian and I used to come here every Christmas. We'd chop firewood, burn too many marshmallows, and sit for hours in silence that never felt awkward. This place holds our laughter, our fights, our forgiveness. That's what Chloe and Gavin didn't understand. The cabin isn't just real estate. It isn't about square footage or property values. It's memory, frozen in cedar and stone. When they set their sights on it, they weren't just after a house, they were trying to erase what it meant. I could feel Daniel in the quiet corners of this place, in the way the floor creaked under my steps, in the cabinet door that never quite closed right because Brian slammed it too hard one summer. I used to think I was keeping the cabin for Brian, so he'd always have something to return to. But now I realized I'd been keeping it because it was the last part of Daniel I could still hold. Gavin wanted to take that from me. Chloe smiled and played innocent, but she knew exactly what she was asking for when she asked for those keys. She wanted the past without earning it. She wanted a legacy without understanding the weight of it. I sat at the edge of our old bed, Daniel's bed, and I looked at the shadows on the wall. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't even angry. What I felt was something sharper, a kind of stillness that comes just before a storm breaks loose. I knew then that I wouldn't just hand it over. I wouldn't let them rewrite our history for their own gain. They thought I was just some lonely widow, holding on to old wood and older memories. They had no idea what this place meant, or what I was willing to do to protect it. I closed my eyes and whispered into the silence, hoping maybe Daniel could hear me. I said I was sorry I hadn't seen it sooner, but I saw it now, and I would not let his work, or our family, be turned into someone else's con. Not while I was still breathing. I didn't rush. Revenge isn't something you serve hot. It needs to be assembled with care, like a fine pie crust or a perfect quilt. Every piece has to be in place, stitched so tightly together that it holds even under fire. So I took my time. First, I printed everything Meredith had given me. Copies of Chloe's previous name change forms, old engagement records, photographs of her and Gavin at a fundraiser in Chicago, tax filings that didn't quite add up, bank account names that had been closed after wire transfers. It wasn't just a trail, it was a map of a scam, and my son was right in the middle of it. I bought a black leather portfolio, the kind lawyers use, slid the papers into transparent sleeves, ordered by date. Every detail, every inconsistency, every name that tied Chloe to Gavin Brooks. Then I wrote a short note and slipped it into the front pocket. Congratulations on your marriage. Every husband deserves to know the full story of the woman he married. With love, Mom. I wrapped the portfolio in cream-colored paper and tied it with a silver ribbon. Simple, elegant, deceptively kind. Then I drove 2 hours to their apartment in Denver and left the package at their doorstep. I didn't ring the bell. I didn't wait. I just walked back to my car and started the engine like I was driving home from the grocery store. Calm, steady. The call came 3 hours later. Brian's name flashed on my screen, but it was his voice I heard first, raised and shaking. He asked me what the hell I had sent them. He shouted about invasion of privacy, about how dare I ruin their honeymoon with lies and accusations. Chloe was crying in the background, or pretending to. I let him scream, let the panic pour out through the phone until he finally ran out of steam. Then I asked one simple question. Have you checked her accounts? There was a pause, just a beat. But I heard it. The silence of a mind trying to connect dots it had worked hard to ignore. Then more shouting. He said I was bitter, jealous, and that I never liked Chloe. He said I was trying to sabotage their marriage because I couldn't stand to be left out. I didn't defend myself. I just said, if none of it's true, you've got nothing to worry about. Then I hung up. By morning, Chloe was gone. Packed a bag. Left no note. Brian called me again. This time quieter. No shouting. No fire. Just confusion and a kind of shaking underneath his words that I hadn't heard since he was 12 and got lost in the woods behind the cabin for 2 hours. He asked me if I really believed Chloe was dangerous. I told him I didn't believe anything. I followed the facts. I handed him the truth. And what he did with it was up to him. That night I lit a fire and sat with a glass of wine while the snow came down outside. I thought about Daniel and how proud he would have been. Not because I'd won, but because I'd protected the life we built. I didn't raise a fool. I raised a man who got lost. But maybe now he was starting to find his way back. Sometimes the gift people need isn't forgiveness or space. Sometimes it's truth wrapped in just enough sharpness to cut through the lies. I didn't give my son a wedding present. I gave him a mirror. And finally, he was starting to look into it. It was just past sunset when I saw the truck pull up the gravel drive. The headlights cut through the trees, like a memory I wasn't sure would ever return. Brian stepped out slowly, not with the pride or defiance I'd heard in his voice days ago, but with the weight of someone who had finally seen too much. He didn't knock. He just opened the door, like he used to when he was a boy coming home from school. I looked up from my knitting and met his eyes. They were red, tired, older. He said nothing at first, and I didn't ask him to. I just stood and opened my arms. When he hugged me, it was the kind of hug you don't give often. The kind that says, I'm sorry and I'm scared and I don't know how to start over. I held him for a long time. Long enough to remind him that, no matter what had happened, this was still his place too. We sat by the fire, the same hearth Daniel built, and I made him tea the way I always had. He asked me if I hated him. I said no. That love and disappointment are different things. That sometimes people get lost, and it's not a weakness to admit it. Its strength is to come back. We talked late into the night. About Chloe. About the lies. About the things he hadn't wanted to see, but now couldn't unsee. He told me he felt like a fool. I told him, fools don't come home. Only the brave do. The next morning, we went down to the creek where he used to fish with Daniel. He didn't say much, just skipped stones across the surface like he was trying to remember something old and simple. I stood beside him, silent, steady, not needing to fix it, just letting him be here. That's the thing about family. Sometimes it breaks. Not with a bang, but with small choices that pull people apart. But if you're lucky, and if you're patient, the pieces find their way back. Brian came home, not to the cabin, to us, to what mattered. And as we stood there in the soft morning light, I knew we'd be okay. Maybe not right away, but eventually, and sometimes eventually is enough. We were sitting on the porch when he asked me. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the yard. Brian looked out at the trees and said, almost in a whisper, "Why did you hold on to this place for so long?" I didn't answer right away. I let the question settle between us, like the quiet breeze moving through the pines. Then I told him the truth, because it's not just wood and nails. It's your father's hands in every corner. It's the floor where you took your first steps. It's where I learned how to live without him, and where I remembered how to live for you. He looked down, like he was ashamed of what he had almost lost. I told him not to be, that people forget what matters when they're chasing what doesn't. But this cabin reminded me, over and over, of who we are, of what we come from, of what love looks like when no one's watching. He nodded, but I saw the tears in his eyes. I reached over, took his hand like I used to when he was little. "You see," I said, "this cabin is memory, sacrifice, laughter, silence, and now, healing. It's not just a place, it's the story of us." He didn't say anything for a while, just held my hand and looked out into the trees like he was seeing them for the first time. Then he asked, quietly, if I was ever going to give it to him. I smiled. "Not because you asked," I said, "but because you came back as the man your father would be proud of. That's who this place is meant for." As the sun dipped behind the ridge, I felt something settle in my chest. Not loss, not fear, peace. The kind that only comes when something broken finds its shape again. I stood, brushing pine needles from my sweater. "Let's go inside," I said. "I'll make us some chili." Just like before. He followed, steps slow but steady, and I knew without needing to say it, the cabin would be his, not because he wanted it, but because he finally understood what it meant.